to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to touch on a topic that's very nice and a bit advanced, which is called the positional or intuitive exchange sacrifice. As we start out in chess, we learn the value of the pieces, and we know that a rook is worth 5 points versus a knight or a bishop only 3. So normally speaking, we would never give up a rook for a minor piece such as a knight or a bishop. However, in this chapter we shall see that there are surely exceptions to that rule. To demonstrate it, I'll share with you a game that one of the greatest of all times, Garry Kasparov, played with the black pieces against Grandmaster Movsesyan. Let's get started with the game. Here we are. The game started out as a Sicilian, and that is exactly the topic of our lesson today. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, pawn captures on d4, knight captures back, knight f6, knight c3 protects the pawn, and of course this is a known crossroad where black can choose between many options, whether playing the dragon or playing the Najdorf or playing the Scheveningen or various other choices. But today we'll look at only the Najdorf, Kasparov's favorite. Throughout the 90s and somewhat even in the past decade, it has been extremely popular to play the so-called English attack, which is generally related to bishop e3 and then f3 g4, as you shall see. The game continued with bishop to e3 developing, and black resumed by playing e6, e5 is the other way to play, and now white continued by playing f3. Without touching too much on the opening part of the game, I just want to let you know that this has all been played many times and nothing new so far has happened. b5, and white plays queen d2 with the idea to then shortly castle to the queen side of the board. Black responded by developing the knight to d7, and here perhaps a bit more accurate may be to play g4 right away compared to white's choice, which has been castling to the queen side. Black continued as expected with bishop b7 developing, and white, as planned, played g4. One of the main ideas of the move is to next chase black's knight from f6 to the edge of the board to h5, where certainly it's not very well positioned and later could be attacked by white's light squared bishop. That explains black's next move, which was to play knight to b6. On one hand, the knight gets closer to the action on the queen side to support black's attack against white's king, but in this particular moment the urgency and the most immediate reason of making this move was in order to clear the d7 square for black's second knight from f6. So if right now white would push the g-pawn to g5, the black knight from f6 would move to d7. White instead continued with a tricky move, moving the queen to f2. Now this move on one hand moved out of a potential attack of black's knight on c4, but more importantly creates an immediate threat. A rather tricky move in creating a threat of discovery. Now that the white queen is on f2, not only the white bishop from e3, but together the white queen and the bishop on e3 are aiming at black's knight on b6. So now, even if the white knight from d4 would move to a square where it would be captured, white may still get out ahead, and therefore white's threat is to capture with the knight on e6 the pawn and then capture black's knight on b6. So that is the threat that black needs to react to. And he did. Garry Kasparov moved immediately the knight from f6 to d7, protecting that knight on b6 a second time. Knowing that white sooner or later probably would have played g5 anyway, and that knight would have moved to d7 regardless of this little tactical threat that black needed to react to. Now it's white's turn again, and white made a preventive move, a very typical move, by moving right now the king out of the c file to b1, as we shall see in a minute. It has been suggested that it was more accurate and urgent to rather instead develop the bishop to d3, and then if b4 comes, for example, the knight would go to e2. Or even if right now black would respond with rook to c8, with the idea to then perhaps capture on c3, as we shall see black did in the actual game, then the white knight again could simply move away from that threat. Let's go back. And in this position, on move 12, white instead, as I mentioned, played king to b1, getting out of the c file, even though it wasn't that terribly urgent. And black naturally developed with rook c8. Well, we can see that black is somewhat delaying the development of the king's side and castling. I have to say that this is an exception when black can and should rather develop his own attack and own counterplay on the other side of the board. However, as we shall see, soon black will not forget completely about his own king and will complete the development on the king side of the board. So after rook c8, white now played bishop to d3. Perhaps even though the bishop is not yet developed right now to d3, it would have been better to play knight c3 to e2 at this juncture. And now we reached the critical, or at least the first critical moment of the game, where we're dealing with the whole theme of our lesson today, and that is an intuitive or positional exchange sacrifice. What is happening is that black gives up a rook for a knight in this case, purely for positional reasons, without having any immediate gain or checkmate. Well, at least not concrete as of winning a rook back or a queen or something like that. However, after the sacrifice of the rook for the knight on c3, it's not hard to understand what white gave up or black got in return for the material sacrifice. On one hand, white's pawn structure has been terribly ruined. On the other hand, the white king on b1 by no means is secure, has been opened up the b file, and therefore potentially can be targeted. And as we shall see, the white king on b1 will get in serious trouble in the not too distant future. So right now it is black's turn, and black has several ways to go. One is, of course, the way Kasparov played himself. Another option would have been to play knight to a4 immediately, attacking the pawn on c3, and if white, for example, retreats the knight to protect that pawn, then just simply continue with development with bishop e7, getting ready to castle. The advantage of this approach over Kasparov's would have been that now the black queen can later choose whether to develop the queen to c7 or to a5. Oftentimes, flexibility is to be preferred versus going immediately to decide where to develop a certain piece. Let's go back now and see how the game itself continued after the sacrifice. Kasparov played queen to c7 right now, immediately attacking the pawn, and just as after knight a4, white immediately retreated the knight to e2, protecting the c3 pawn. And black responded with bishop e7 to hurry up and castle. The most important reason in castling in this case is not necessarily that the black king would be that much in a better position on g8 versus being in the middle. However, the black rook will certainly be in a much better position on f8, or more importantly, on the other side of black's king. So the point is, black wants to use his own rook in the attack against white's king. So therefore, castling is quite important to get the rook into the game. And white continued by playing g5, and black wasn't scared, castled anyway. And right now, white continued with h4, with the idea, very typical for such Sicilians, to advance the h-pawn further to h5 and then try to open some files on the king's side, the g or the h file, by then pushing either the g or h-pawn forward to attack black's king. Interestingly, this very position has been reached in another game years earlier in 1993, where black continued in this position immediately by playing d5. However, white played h5 and eventually won the game. So the next move of black's, which was knight a4, which is an excellent move, it is an improvement over that game between Zagrabelny and Lingnau. Right now, black is attacking the pawn on c3 a second time, and also the black knight got closer towards the white king. White's best option right now was, instead of the game move, to indeed follow up with that plan, play h5, and then try to open some file against black's king. For example, black would continue with knight e5. If h6, black would respond by playing g6, making sure those files don't get opened up real soon. Okay, so black probably would have an excellent position in this case as well, but in the game things turned out even worse for white. Going back to the game, white continued in this position with bishop c1, in hopes that black would go for the pawn on c3, and then after the trade, white would gain time to activate that bishop on b2 that now is aiming towards black's king's side. But black does not need to be greedy, and there is no rush to capture that pawn on c3. Black can do much better, and Garry Kasparov indeed did better by playing knight e5, getting the second knight centralized and activated, going towards white's queen side, and after h5, a very critical moment, kind of very similar to what black did in the other game, but now the timing is clearly better, to play d5 immediately in this position. The idea is clear. It opens up the diagonal of black's dark squared bishop, and also in case, for example, white would now capture on d5, the black bishop would capture back, and we can see how now that bishop also participates in the attack. The game now continued with white playing queen h2. Let's see for a moment what would happen if white instead plays h6. Of course, black would push through and play g6, making sure those kingside files remain closed. And if now white, for example, plays queen g3, trying to pin the black knight on e5, black would play bishop to d6 with an excellent position. Again, let's continue and see how the game continued when white played queen h2, pinning again the black knight. Similarly to the previous variation, black responds with bishop to d6. Now, some very scary discovered attacks are in the air by moving the black knight. Here white played queen to h3. It has been suggested by Kasparov that it was better to play queen f2, even though black's compensation is clear in any case. Black would probably continue with rook c8, getting ready, mobilizing more and more pieces towards white's queen side. The game instead continued with white playing queen to h3, protecting the pawn on f3. And now things started happening. Knight captured on d3. White recaptured with the pawn. Let's see for a moment what would happen if white instead recaptures with the rook. Well, then the problem is that the pawn on e4 is hanging, and black's clearly better. So let's go back and see what happened after the pawn captured. Again, it was an opportunity to capture the pawn on c3, although it's an inferior option than what black chose. Let's see for a moment what happens if knight takes, queen takes, bishop b2, queen b4, and now at least white has some counterattack by playing g6. In this position, for example, capturing on e4 would be already a probably losing mistake, as white would immediately play h6, and black cannot avoid the opening of one of the kingside files. And bishop e5 would be answered with d4, with a winning attack for white in this case. Let's go back again for a moment. In this position, after the knight takes on c3, of course things weren't quite as bad, but black just shouldn't have taken the pawn on e4. Nevertheless, the best way to continue in this position is the way Kasparov did, by opening the b file, by playing b4. A very powerful move. White right now in the actual game captured on b4. Before we look at the game further, let's see what could have happened if white plays c4. Well, obviously black would just capture, and if now g6, just keep capturing and opening the file. Now of course the black queen is about to enter on c2. Unless white captures, and then again black prepares the same idea by playing rook to c8, and then if white protects the c2 square with rook d2, black would play bishop e5. The bishop is on a killer square there. For example, let's see the following variation. If rook h to d1, then bishop c6. An interesting move, which we'll see real quick. What's the idea behind? h6, knight c3 check, knight takes, pawn takes check. Of course the king doesn't take back, but hides behind white's pawn, king h8, takes, bishop takes, and now after rook c2 we'll understand the idea behind the bishop c6 move to now finally play bishop a4. And black of course is winning. Let's go back again and see what happened in the actual game. After b4, white captured the pawn on b4 right away, and black in the opened c file brought the rook with the same threat of queen c2. For example, if the queen retreats to f1 to protect the knight, the black queen would come in anyway with a check and then capture bishop b4 with a killer attack. As we can see, all the black pieces are attacking white's king. Instead of queen f1, the game continued right now by white moving the king to the corner, kind of getting away from the check. Right now, black's best choice would have been to actually just capture the pawn on b4 right away, and then move the queen to c2. For example, queen h2, queen c2, and now knight c3 is a killer threat. For example, g6, knight c3. And white will get checkmated real soon. After king a1, the game continued actually with pawn takes pawn on e4, and white recaptured with the f-pawn. Before we go further in the game, let's see what could have happened if the other pawn captures back. Well then, black would check with the bishop, and a quite cute mating combination is about to happen. After the exchange on d4, white suffers from a back rank checkmate coming after the queen sacrifice. Very nice line. Let's go back again and continue with the game after pawn captures back on e4, and now the most effective and fastest way to win is beautiful combination with bishop e4. If now the pawn captures back, the same exact idea would come about with the back rank checkmate after bishop check. If king b1, queen c2 checkmates right away, or if knight d4, bishop takes the knight, and then queen takes on c1. So again, let's go back just a tiny bit. After bishop captured on e4, white continued by playing g6. Unfortunately for white, the attack comes a bit too late. Black now simply captured the rook, queen captured back, bishop captured on b4, and pawn captured on f7. Similarly, as if the pawn would have captured on h7, the king would have been hiding behind the pawn by playing king h8 and not capturing back on h7. Just as now, the king moved to f8, although king f7 in this case was playable, such as queen f7 as well. White played queen g2, and now a very smart move for black, rook b8. And now black is threatening to play bishop to c3, which would result in a very fast checkmate. The game continued with bishop b2, threatening all of a sudden on g7, but black simply captures. If now the king captures back, the black bishop will have a discovered check, and then checkmate real soon. For example, king b2, then bishop d2. But white counterattacked by playing knight d4, all of a sudden threatening with knight e6. But black can ignore actually white's threat, and that's how the game finished with a beautiful combination, knight takes rook, allowing knight takes, and now if knight takes queen, bishop c3 checkmates. Queen g7 is not much better either, because now after queen takes queen, bishop c3, white can only avoid a checkmate by giving the queen up for the bishop, and then of course black would have a major material advantage, and nevertheless then checkmate on the move after. A beautifully played game by Garry Kasparov, a good example on the typical exchange sacrifice in the Sicilian on c3, and also a great example on how to play with attacks on opposite side castles. And now let's go on and see the jewel of the week. And now here we go. In this position it is white's turn, and the question is what to do about black's a2 pawn. It seems that it's game over. Black will promote that pawn, and then win the game. I suggest you take some time, maybe 10-15 minutes, and try to figure out, is there a way for white to save the game, or moreover, maybe even win the game? Then come back and listen to the solution. And here is the answer. The first move is, a bit surprising, immediately giving up the g-pawn. We'll see the reason very soon why. g7, bishop takes, and now another quiet move, but a rather important one, playing b3. The reason is that if white right now would play bishop f3 right away, then black could push the a-pawn and open up space for the black king on a5 to run away. And then, if b4, black would do en passant. That's why it was so important, even by wasting a tempo, but prevent that en passant opportunity. Therefore, b4. Now, if black would push the a-pawn, then white would push b4 and prevent the escape of black's king. Black promotes the pawn to a queen, and now comes bishop f3, threatening to checkmate on b7. Black plays e4, bishop takes. Now we'll see the big difference, namely that if the black bishop would still be back in the corner, then the g7 square would be free for the black queen to retreat to and guard the key b7 square, where white is about to checkmate. b5, trying to escape with the king, but white just pushes through and takes the b6 square away from black's king. If now black advances the b-pawn, then white just checkmates with bishop d3. Or, after a4, when the king tries to escape, just b4, and black has no defense against the checkmate on b7. A beautiful composition by Procas. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess ideas. Bye-bye.